This is roll 11, slate 1. Did Visnews commit itself to telling the truth no matter whose toes they trod on?
Visnews didn't always go all out to tell the complete story. They were very conscious of the fact... Oh, we'd better split it. I'm sorry. I can do it. This is starting that take again. When Visnews cut my film, they didn't always tell the exact truth. If it was unpalatable to some people, they downplayed it. This was because they were conscious very much of the fact that they had clients all over the world. For instance, they serviced Peking television and Taiwan television, East and West Germany, in fact all of communist Eastern Europe and Western Europe. That restricted them and hampered them in their thinking a great deal. At the same time, it did ensure that they told a balanced story. They may have downplayed some of the more unpalatable aspects, but it was balanced for the same reason as they played down some of the more unpalatable aspects, which perhaps showed the communists in a bad light or the free world in a bad light.
Those children's voices, were they?
No, it's okay.
Today you've said that...
I think that's okay.
Today you've said that Visnews were reasonable with the way they edited your film, and earlier interviews you said the best you could expect from them was that they wouldn't butcher it.
Yes, I at least was satisfied that Visnews wouldn't butcher my film. But you know, no cameraman or correspondent is satisfied completely with the way somebody else handles his film. So, in overall terms, I was happy I worked for Visnews and not for a individual television organisation or network.
Or would you, you wouldn't put it rather in stronger terms that the best you could expect or the most you could hope for was that they wouldn't butcher your film?
I was often disappointed, even angry, that very good hard stories, hard-hitting stories, were downplayed and even some points eliminated by Visnews in the editing of my film. But
let me pose three different aspects of the war, important aspects of the war, and tell me whether you filmed them or whether you thought they were legitimate things to film. When the Vietnam War ended, there was something like 500,000 prostitutes left in Vietnam. Did you at any stage do any film of the prostitutes and the tens of thousands of Americans and journalists as well that would have visited the brothels?
During the war, I sometimes included those aspects in an overall picture. Saigon today, or Vietnam leading up to peace, or Vietnam falling, whatever. Yes, I included stories of the degeneration of morals, if you like, due to the war and due to the very heavy American influence and the fact that there were 500,000 soldiers there. I didn't dwell on those aspects because it was only one point, only one facet of the complete story. Whilst there may have been tens of thousands of prostitutes, there were millions of very fine people who lived up to their cultural values. And in fact, you know, prostitution in many instances in Vietnam was a way that families lived. The fathers and sons and husbands may have been killed in the war. They lost so many people in the war, not only soldiers but civilians. And
it was the way they lived, but was it a legitimate way for them to live or to be forced into? And did you try and present that?
It was the only way that some families lived, was by living on the earnings of their daughters, or in some cases wives, who were prostitutes. Whilst I covered that aspect, I at the same time tried to cover it sympathetically. Of course, not all prostitutes were in the business to save their families. Many of them were in it just to make a lot of money like they are in other parts of the world. But in many, many cases, it was to earn money so that their families could eat.
What about the journalists that would go to brothels? Would you think that was fair game to present that story, or was that a taboo subject?
It wasn't exactly taboo, but it was such a small aspect. And I've got to admit that you can't cover every aspect. I don't think that was important. You could say that foreigners, and including soldiers, including journalists, if you like, were some of the prostitutes' best customers. Also, so were Vietnamese soldiers, for that matter.
But it was the degeneration of women. It was a putting down of them. It was virtual slavery by the fact that they were forced into doing it.
A number of them were forced into doing it, and a number of them were not forced into doing it. Prostitution is inevitable in a country at war. Sometimes when they're not deeply involved in the war. Australians should know about that. In World War II you had plenty of prostitutes who lived on earnings supplied by the Americans.
In Vietnam too, King's Cross. All right then. Okay, second point. There are numerous stories about corruption in the Arvin, about phantom battalions, and about gun selling to the Viet Cong. Not all these reports could have been wrong. Did you do any stories about corruption in the army?
Yes, I did stories on corruption in the army from time to time. I don't know what the percentage would be, but I also did stories on units that were not corrupt and commanders who were not corrupt. I did cover corruption. I even covered torture once. I covered South Vietnamese soldiers torturing Viet Cong in the field. I did that at great risk to my own life. I didn't continually look for that to go and do it, because it didn't happen all that often, relatively speaking. But I did do it on one specific occasion because it was part of the way this particular unit operated.
So, I mean, you had a lot of regard for the South Vietnamese army. You don't think you had blinkers on as far as covering certain aspects?
No, I covered all their painful defeats and all the things that were wrong. It was just that for years and years, the other correspondents and the other television people felt that there was nothing right with the Vietnamese. I wanted to show that there was something right and something wrong, and I tried to do that in as well-balanced a fashion as possible.
When you have an army that sells guns to its enemy, isn't there something...
Very few, very few commanders or soldiers sold guns to the Viet Cong or North Vietnamese. They didn't need them, you know. We didn't have AK-47s. They got them from Russia and China. They didn't want our M16s and the Armalite. They didn't want the FN rifle. Very few dead or captured Viet Cong and North Vietnamese had FN rifles or Armalites, M16s, you know. They had AK-47s. That answers the question in itself. The arms were not sold on a large scale at all, a minute scale.
What about phantom battalions?
There weren't phantom battalions, there were phantom troops. A battalion always existed. They may be only at half its supposed strength, paper strength, might be 500 and there may be only 300 there. But there weren't phantom battalions as such, phantom soldiers, and that was an individual thing with the corrupt commanders. Yes, I did stories on why Vietnamese units were defeated. They were defeated because they were under strength. When there were supposed to be 500 men, they were 200 men, and that's why they were defeated. And I included that in stories to show that the 200 had fought amazingly well.
Was it widespread phantom troops?
You could say the practice of having phantom troops was widespread, but it wasn't a factor that led to the defeat of the South Vietnamese army. There would be a few phantom troops in perhaps 50% of the units. Good.